Grayson, the owner of a real estate empire, was driving through the busy streets near his office when something unusual caught his eye. Sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall of an old building, was a young woman. She was wrapped in a worn-out blanket, arms crossed tightly to ward off the cold. Her tangled hair fell over her face as she stared at the ground with an empty expression. She wasn't asking for anything, just existing quietly in the chaos of the city. Grayson looked away but glanced back, finding it strange that someone so young could be in such a state. When the light turned green, he drove on, but the image of her lingered. At home, he tried to go about his usual routine, but something was off. The woman's face kept coming to mind, and an irritation stirred within him for even caring. After all, so many people lived on the streets. Why was she different? He tried distracting himself with TV and work, but nothing helped. Her image lingered, and finally he grabbed his keys and went back to that corner, driven by an inexplicable urge to understand. When he arrived, she was still there, motionless as if frozen in time. The crowd had changed, but she remained. Grayson parked his car and approached. The young woman noticed him but didn't move. When he stopped a few feet away, she looked up, her eyes wary. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm. Caught off guard, he stammered, "I saw you here earlier. Are you okay?" Her sarcasm was sharp but not hostile. "I'm sitting on a street corner wrapped in an old blanket. What do you think?" she replied. Grayson tried to soften his tone, insisting he meant no offense and just wanted to help. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I need a lot of things, but you can't give me any of them." "Maybe I can," he said, but she shook her head, clearly tired of such encounters. "You want to help? Great. Then leave me alone." Her words stung more than he expected. She wasn't like the people he knew, those who sought favors or tried to impress him. She seemed uninterested in anything he had to offer. "What's your name?" he asked. She sighed, as if answering was a waste of energy. "Zoe." "I'm Grayson," he offered, but she didn't reply, returning her gaze to the ground. He lingered for a few moments, sensing he wasn't welcome but reluctant to leave. Finally, he stepped back. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said impulsively. "You don't need to come back," she replied, her voice low. Grayson didn't answer. He walked back to his car, frustration brewing. He didn't understand why this woman affected him so deeply, but there was something about her he couldn't ignore. That night, lying in bed, he realized he hadn't thought about himself all day, a realization that both intrigued and unsettled him. The next morning, Grayson wasn't the same. Images of Zoe on that corner haunted him. During a morning meeting, he found himself distracted, his focus pulled away from the numbers and charts that used to captivate him. By the afternoon, he made a decision that felt irrational, even to him. He canceled his schedule and returned to the corner. She was still there, in the same spot, wrapped in her blanket. Grayson parked farther away this time, observing for a few moments before walking over. Zoe noticed him and said, "You came back," her tone a mixture of surprise and irritation. "I said I would," he replied. "Don't you have anything better to do?" she asked, clearly exasperated. "Maybe I do," he admitted, "but this feels more important." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Important? For someone like you? What could possibly matter here?" Grayson didn't have a clear answer. "I want to help," he said simply. Zoe's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why?" "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but something tells me you deserve more than this." Her expression hardened. "You think you know me? You think you know what I deserve?" "I don't," Grayson said honestly. "But I want to." Zoe studied him, her guard still up. Finally, she sighed, her voice softening just a little. "I used to have a home, a job, a normal life. But that's all gone now. And this is what's left." Grayson felt a tightness in his chest at Zoe's sharp words. He hadn't expected her to be so direct or so guarded. "I'm not here to judge you or pry into what happened," he said. "I just want to help somehow." She narrowed her eyes, her tone skeptical. "But because seeing someone like me makes your conscience ache?" Her suspicion was understandable, and Grayson hesitated before replying. "Maybe I'm just tired of looking at numbers and forgetting that there are real people out there," he said. Zoe studied him for a moment, then let out a short laugh. All right, millionaire. If you want to help, I'll take food. That's all. Relieved to have found a way in, Grayson nodded and left to find her something to eat. He returned a few minutes later with a sandwich and a bottle of water. Zoe accepted them silently, her expression a mix of gratitude and reluctance. Thank you, she said softly as she began eating. Grayson stood nearby, watching her in thoughtful silence. Up close, she looked even younger than he had thought, probably not even 25, but her posture and expression carried a strength he couldn't ignore. How long have you been here? He asked cautiously, not wanting to push too hard. Zoe hesitated before replying. A few months. Since I lost everything. Family, friends, it doesn't matter now. She cut him off before he could respond, meeting his gaze. I don't need anyone asking about my story just to satisfy their curiosity. Grayson raised his hands in surrender. I'm sorry. That wasn't my intention. He didn't press further, sensing that her trust would take time. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the city rushing past them. Finally, Grayson stood. I'll be back tomorrow, he said simply. Zoe didn't respond, but he felt her eyes on him as he walked away. On the drive home, Grayson felt a strange combination of relief and restlessness. Something about Zoe stayed with him, a quiet insistence that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his work and wealth. The next day, as promised, Grayson returned. This time, he brought food and a thick new blanket. When Zoe saw him approaching, her expression softened slightly, though her guard remained. Good morning, he said, placing the bag beside her. You're persistent, huh? She said, her voice lacking the sharpness of their first encounter. Let's just say I don't give up easily. Zoe opened the bag cautiously and pulled out the blanket, her fingers brushing the soft fabric. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice quieter. I know. They sat together again as she ate, with Grayson on the curb beside her. People passed by, casting curious glances at the unlikely pair, but he paid them no mind. You're used to hearing thank you, aren't you? She asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. Not always, he said, surprised by her question. Zoe looked at him thoughtfully. A millionaire sitting on the ground with a homeless woman. That must be a first. It's definitely out of my comfort zone, he admitted, chuckling at himself. But maybe that's exactly what I need. Zoe didn't respond immediately, and when she finally spoke, her voice was more serious. Why do you keep coming here? Grayson paused before answering. Because I think you deserve more than this. And because, in some strange way, I think I need to be here too. She averted her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. You said you used to have a home and a job. How did you end up here? He asked gently. Zoe hesitated but eventually answered. I lost my job about a year ago. After that, everything fell apart. The house was the first to go. Friends, family, they all disappeared over time. Now this is all I have. Grayson felt a knot form in his chest as he listened. He thought of how many people must have similar stories, people he'd passed by without a second thought. Have you ever tried to get help? Maybe a shelter? Shelters aren't safe for women, she replied bluntly. I'd rather be alone. Her answer weighed heavily on him. He didn't know how to fix her situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to try. You're different, Zoe, he said after a moment. Even here, like this, you have a strength most people don't. Zoe laughed, this time with a trace of real humor. Special? You don't even know me, Grayson. Maybe I want to, he said softly. She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what do you get out of this? She asked. Nothing, he replied honestly. This isn't about getting anything. Everyone wants something, she said, her tone quieter now. Even you. Grayson fell silent, realizing she was right. Maybe he did want something, but he didn't know what it was yet. Grayson wasn't entirely sure what drove him to keep coming back to Zoe. Maybe I'm just trying to learn something from you, he said one day. Zoe laughed, shaking her head. You have a strange idea of learning. Despite her defenses, Grayson sensed her guard lowering, little by little. As he prepared to leave, he did something unexpected. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. This is my office number. If you need anything at all, call me. Zoe took the card with a neutral expression but said nothing. See you tomorrow, Grayson said as he walked away. She watched him go, holding the card as if it were a puzzle she wasn't sure how to solve. That night, Grayson realized his life was changing. Money and power, which had once seemed so essential, now felt hollow. Meeting Zoe had made him question everything. Meanwhile, Zoe sat on the corner, staring at the card. Part of her wanted to toss it away, but another part, a quiet, hopeful whisper, wondered if someone had finally seen past her poverty and despair. Days turned into weeks. Grayson kept visiting Zoe, and while she remained cautious, she began to let him in, sharing pieces of her story. Over time, the flickers of trust grew stronger. Grayson, in turn, wrestled with how to help her without overwhelming her or making her feel obligated. One cloudy afternoon, Grayson arrived at the corner to find Zoe looking worse than usual. She was pale, clutching her stomach in obvious pain. "Zoe, what's wrong?" he asked, crouching beside her. "It's nothing," she said weakly. "It doesn't look like nothing. Are you sick?" Zoe hesitated, then sighed heavily. "I'm pregnant, okay?" Her tone was defiant, as if daring him to judge her. The revelation hit Grayson hard. "Pregnant? How long have you known?" "A few weeks," Zoe admitted, looking away. "But it doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" "Zoe, this changes everything." She laughed bitterly. "Change? I'm living on the streets. Now I'll have a baby on the streets. What else could possibly change?" Grayson felt a lump in his throat. The thought of Zoe facing such a monumental challenge alone was unbearable. "Does the father know?" "He disappeared when he found out," Zoe said coldly. Grayson fell silent, grappling with the weight of her situation. Finally he spoke. "Zoe, you can't keep going like this. You need care. A safe place. And what do you suggest? A shelter? I've told you that's not an option." "Then come with me," Grayson said firmly. Zoe stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Are you crazy?" "Oh, I'm being practical. You need help and I can give it to you. I'm not asking for anything in return." She shook her head, clearly skeptical. "What's in it for you? Are you trying to turn me into some charity project to make yourself feel better?" "This isn't about me, Zoe. It's about you and your baby." Zoe stayed silent, staring at the ground. Behind her resistance, Grayson saw fear. "I get why you're skeptical," he said gently. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it." He left some food and clothes before saying goodbye, promising to return the next day. That night, Zoe found herself staring at Grayson's card for hours. His offer was overwhelming, but the thought of bringing a child into the world while living on the streets was even more terrifying. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. When Grayson returned the next day, Zoe was waiting for him. "I'll accept your help," she said, her voice firm but her eyes filled with hesitation. Grayson smiled, his relief evident. "You're making the right choice, Zoe. Let's change your life." The journey was far from easy. Grayson moved Zoe into a small apartment, ensuring she had food, clothes, and access to medical care. But outside the walls of her new refuge, chaos brewed. At work, in the press, and even among his family, Grayson's decision was questioned, mocked, and criticized. One morning, as he walked into his office, the whispers that had once been discreet were now loud and biting. "Looks like the boss is recruiting from the streets now," someone joked. "Watch out," another added. "She might take your spot as director." Grayson heard it all but didn't flinch. He knew the world around him wouldn't understand. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't living for their approval. Grayson walked briskly to the elevator, ignoring the biting comments and muffled laughter from his colleagues. Each remark was like a small jab, testing his patience. On the executive floor, the atmosphere was no better. During a board meeting, Ricardo, known for his sharp tongue, addressed the elephant in the room. "Grayson, can we talk about your new situation?" Ricardo asked, his tone casual but dripping with provocation. Grayson took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. "Go ahead, Ricardo. Is it true what everyone's saying? That you're involved with, well, a homeless woman?" Ricardo smirked as silence fell over the room, all eyes on Grayson. Grayson met his gaze steadily. Yes, it's true. I'm helping Zoe, a woman who was living on the streets and is pregnant. The murmurs that followed were almost deafening. Grayson raised his hand, demanding silence. Before anyone says something foolish, let me make this clear. I will not tolerate disrespect toward her. Ricardo, unfazed, pressed on with a smug grin. I understand your position, Grayson, but you must see how this affects the company's image. The press is already talking. Wouldn't it be more prudent to, distance yourself from the situation? Grayson stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Prudent? His voice was firm, simmering with restrained anger. Are you suggesting I abandon someone in need to protect the company's image? Ricardo opened his mouth to respond, but Grayson didn't give him the chance. I love Zoe. I will take care of her and this baby as if they were my own family. If anyone here has a problem with that, the door is open. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Grayson scanned the faces of his colleagues, daring anyone to challenge him. When no one spoke, he left the meeting, heading straight to his office to collect his thoughts. Meanwhile, at home, Zoe was battling her own insecurities. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, she voiced her fears. You don't have to do this, Grayson, she said softly. Do what? He asked, setting down his fork. Fight for me, for us. It's not worth it. Grayson looked at her intently. Don't say that, Zoe. You're worth it, both of you are. She looked away, her voice trembling. I don't want you to regret this someday, to think it was all a mistake. Grayson reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I will never regret helping you, Zoe. Never. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, unwavering sincerity. The next day, Grayson decided to confront the office gossip head-on. He called a company-wide meeting, an unprecedented move. Standing on an improvised stage, he addressed the room. I know many of you have been talking about my personal life, he began. About Zoe. So let me clear the air. The room fell silent as everyone listened. Yes, I'm helping a woman who used to live on the streets. Yes, she's pregnant. And yes, I love her. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Grayson raised a hand to quiet them. I understand that this might seem unusual or even inconvenient to some of you. But frankly, I don't care. I'm not abandoning her or the baby because of gossip or pressure. If anyone here feels that my decision affects their ability to work, you're free to look for employment elsewhere. In this company, respect and humanity are non-negotiable. The room was silent once more. Grayson held his ground, ensuring his words resonated with every person present. When he returned home that evening, Zoe noticed a change in him. What happened? She asked as he removed his jacket. Grayson gave a tired but contented smile. I did what needed to be done. In the weeks that followed, the pressure didn't let up. At work, Grayson dealt with the fallout of his declaration, while at home, Zoe adjusted to her new reality. Despite the safety and support, she still wrestled with fear and uncertainty. One morning, Grayson accompanied Zoe to a routine obstetric appointment. He insisted on being there for every step, even when Zoe initially protested. During the ultrasound, Zoe was visibly nervous, her hand gripping Grayson's tightly. It's going to be okay, he whispered with a reassuring smile. When the image appeared on the screen, the room grew still. Congratulations, the doctor said, smiling. The baby is developing well. Zoe stared at the monitor, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time, it felt real. It's incredible, she whispered. Grayson couldn't take his eyes off the screen. Though the baby wasn't biologically his, he felt a profound connection to the tiny life. Afterward, he took Zoe to a nearby cafe. She was quiet, stirring her tea absently. What's on your mind? Grayson asked gently. That was the first time it felt real, Zoe admitted. And it's terrifying. Terrifying how? Terrifying that I won't be enough. That I'll fail as a mother. Grayson reached across the table, holding her hand. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here to Zoe. And I always will be. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sincerity in his voice left her speechless. For the first time in a long while, She felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually turn out okay. Grayson's phone buzzed, breaking the peaceful moment. He glanced at the screen and saw his mother's name. He hesitated before answering, knowing the conversation would be far from pleasant. "Grayson, we need to talk," Beatrice said, skipping any greeting. "I'm busy right now, Mom," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I don't care. This is about that woman. I won't let you ruin your life over a reckless decision." Grayson stood, walking away from the table to take the call in private, leaving Zoe watching him curiously. "My life isn't yours to control, Mom," he said firmly. "Do you even hear yourself? You're taking on a baby that isn't yours." "This is absurd, Grayson," she shot back. "What I see, Mom, is that you're more concerned with appearances than doing what's right," he retorted. Silence hung heavy on the line, but Grayson didn't waver. "Zoe is my family now. If you can't accept that, then maybe the problem isn't with me." Before she could respond, he ended the call and returned to the table. "Everything okay?" Zoe asked cautiously. "Yeah, just family stuff," Grayson replied, his tone lighter than his emotions. In the days that followed, Grayson poured himself into preparing for the baby's arrival. He bought furniture, clothing, and every essential Zoe might need. Though she was grateful, Zoe couldn't shake the unease of depending so heavily on him. One evening, as Grayson assembled a crib in the living room, Zoe sat nearby, watching quietly. "Are you really willing to do all this for me?" she asked hesitantly. Grayson paused, looking up from his work. "It's not just for you, Zoe. It's for the baby. For the family we're building." His words settled deeply in her heart. For the first time in years, Zoe felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that her life could be different. Over time, the bond between them grew stronger. Grayson, who once lived for work alone, found himself prioritizing Zoe and the baby. Zoe, though still wrestling with insecurities, began to see Grayson as someone truly different from anyone she'd ever known. One evening during dinner, Zoe watched Grayson serve her meal with his usual attentiveness. "You didn't have to do all this, you know," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "What else would I do? Let you go hungry?" he teased, placing the plate in front of her. She laughed softly. "It's not that. It's just, no one's ever cared for me like this before." Grayson sat down beside her, taking her hand. "I want to take care of you, Zoe. Not just because of the baby, but because you matter to me." Her heart raced at his words. She was falling for him, but fear held her back. Before she could respond, Grayson looked into her eyes and said, "I love you, Zoe." She froze, caught off guard, but deep down she knew she felt the same. Before she could find the courage to say so, his phone rang. Grayson sighed, answering reluctantly. His expression quickly darkened. "The board scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow," he said. "Something's happening at the company." The next morning, Grayson faced the board. The tension in the room was palpable. Ricardo, one of the most influential members, spoke bluntly. "Grayson, your personal decisions have caused concern among investors. We believe it's best if you step away from the board temporarily." Grayson felt the words hit him like a blow. "Step away? From the company I built? Is this temporary?" he demanded, trying to rein in his frustration. "It's what's best for everyone," Ricardo replied, avoiding his gaze. Grayson left the meeting feeling betrayed and furious. At home, Zoe immediately noticed his mood. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "They removed me from the board," he said bitterly. Her face fell, guilt filling her eyes. "This is my fault, Grayson." "No, Zoe. It's not your fault. It's theirs, people who can't see what really matters," he said, trying to reassure her. But Zoe's guilt wouldn't ease. That night, while Grayson slept, she made a difficult decision. Zoe left a note on the table and quietly slipped out of the apartment. Grayson, I can't keep being a burden in your life. You deserve your company, your reputation, and your peace. I'll take care of myself and the baby on my own. Please don't look for me. Zoe *. When Grayson woke and found the letter, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "No, Zoe. No," he whispered, his voice breaking. He grabbed his phone, frantically trying to call her, but the number was disconnected. Panicked, he rushed out, driving through the streets, stopping at every place he thought she might be. Hours passed as he searched, asking anyone he could if they had seen her, desperation mounting with each passing moment. But Zoe was nowhere to be found. By nightfall, Grayson found himself at a busy park, a crowd gathered around a flashing ambulance. His heart pounded as he pushed through the crowd, seeking answers. He finally reached the front and saw Zoe being lifted onto a stretcher, unconscious. His legs almost gave way beneath him at the sight. "Zoe!" he shouted, rushing toward her. A paramedic stopped him, holding out a hand. "Do you know this woman?" "She's my wife," Grayson stammered, panic rising in his chest. "What happened?" "She was found collapsed on the ground. She's extremely weak, likely dehydrated. We're not sure about the baby's condition yet," the paramedic explained. Grayson climbed into the ambulance beside Zoe, holding her hand tightly as the paramedics worked to stabilize her. "Stay with me, Zoe, please stay with me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Hours later, Grayson paced the hospital waiting room, unable to sit still. His mind raced with worry and guilt. Finally, a doctor approached him, and Grayson was on his feet immediately. "Doctor, how is she?" "How's the baby?" he asked urgently. "The situation is critical," the doctor replied, his expression grim. "She's very weak, and the stress has worsened her condition. We need to keep her hospitalized indefinitely to ensure her and the baby's safety." Grayson nodded, a mix of relief that she was alive and despair over the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He went to Zoe's room, where she lay in bed, her face pale and strained. When their eyes met, tears filled her gaze. "I'm so sorry," Zoe whispered. Grayson sat beside her and took her hands in his. "Why did you do this, Zoe? Why would you risk your life and the baby's?" "I didn't want to be a burden to you," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "I've lost so much already, I didn't want you to lose more because of me." Grayson shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've never been a burden, Zoe. You and the baby are my family. Nothing matters more than that." Zoe began to cry, and Grayson pulled her close, promising that she would never feel alone again. As Zoe remained hospitalized, Grayson was faced with the challenge of keeping their family together while navigating the delicate situation. He spent every night by her side, hardly sleeping as guilt and worry consumed him. The following morning, as Grayson arranged flowers on her bedside table, Zoe watched him silently, her eyes filled with emotions she struggled to express. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly. Grayson stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because I put you in this situation," Zoe whispered. "If I hadn't come into your life, you'd still have your company, your peace." Grayson sighed and sat down beside her, taking her fragile hand in his. "I haven't lost anything that truly matters. You and this baby are all I need." Zoe turned her head, fighting back tears. "I don't know if I can handle all of this, Grayson." "You don't have to handle it alone," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I'm here." Just then, a man appeared at the front desk of the hospital. It was Pedro, the biological father of Zoe's baby. He had learned of her condition through sensational headlines and, rather than out of concern, showed up driven by curiosity and a desire to protect himself from any public scandal. When Pedro found Zoe's room, it was clear that his presence wasn't welcomed. Grayson was sitting beside her, and when Pedro entered, his fake sympathy only heightened the tension. "Zoe," Pedro began as if they were old friends. Zoe, pale and weak, froze at the sound of his voice. Grayson immediately stood, his protective instincts kicking in. "Who are you?" Grayson demanded, his voice firm. "I'm Pedro, the baby's father," the man said with a smirk, his eyes filled with feigned concern. Grayson's blood boiled. "What do you want here?" "I just want to help. I heard she was here and thought I could do something," Pedro said with a shrug. Zoe's voice finally broke through the tension. "You disappeared, Pedro. Don't pretend you care now." Pedro feigned indifference. "Things were complicated, Zoe, but I'm here now." Grayson stepped forward, his body blocking Pedro's view of Zoe. "She doesn't need you. We're fine without your help." Pedro looked at Grayson with disdain. And who are you to decide that? Grayson's tone was unyielding. I'm the man who's taking care of her and the baby you abandoned. The room was charged with tension, and Pedro, realizing he was out of place, left without another word, though not before casting a final, empty glare at Zoe. This isn't over, he muttered before exiting. Once the door closed behind him, Zoe began to tremble, her hands gripping the sheets tightly. Grayson immediately wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. He won't come back, Zoe, Grayson assured her, his voice firm with resolve. I'll make sure of it. Zoe looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. What if he tries something? Grayson took a deep breath, his determination unwavering. Then he'll have to get through me first. That night, as Zoe slept, Grayson began planning how to protect her and their future. He knew Pedro couldn't be trusted, and his return couldn't go unaddressed. In the days that followed, Grayson took steps to secure a safer future for Zoe. He hired a lawyer to learn about Pedro's legal rights and began looking for a permanent home for them, away from the chaos. Meanwhile, Anna, who had once questioned Grayson's commitment, started to accept the depth of his love for Zoe. His constant presence, even amidst the hardest of challenges, proved that he was ready to fight for them. One afternoon, as Grayson sorted through some paperwork in Zoe's hospital room, she turned to him. Grayson, I want to start over, she said softly. I want to leave all this behind. A smile spread across Grayson's face as he moved closer to her. We'll start over, together, he promised. The days following the encounter with Pedro were filled with tension. Grayson became more determined than ever to protect Zoe and their unborn child, while the shadow of the past seemed to hang over them. Zoe grew quieter, the confrontation with Pedro reopening old wounds she thought had long healed. Grayson, unwilling to wait for another confrontation, hired a lawyer and began preparing documents to ensure Pedro couldn't interfere in their lives. He also increased security at the hospital and arranged for a guard to accompany Zoe during her stay. Zoe, on the other hand, struggled with a storm of emotions. Part of her still carried the weight of her past with Pedro, but Grayson's unwavering support was slowly shifting her perspective. One morning, while Grayson was at the hospital, Zoe decided to finally speak up. Grayson, do you think people will ever accept us? She asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. He looked at her, surprised by the question. I don't care what people think, he replied. What matters to me is what we think about ourselves. He took her hand, his warmth and steadiness offering her comfort. I just want our baby to grow up in peace. And he will, Grayson promised. I'll make sure of it. Her heart felt lighter at his words, but the reality outside their bubble remained harsh. That same week, new headlines erupted, with Pedro trying to manipulate the media. He gave interviews claiming that Zoe had lied about him and that Grayson was being manipulated. The media, ever eager for scandal, turned the situation into a circus. One headline read, Millionaire seduced by pregnant homeless woman. At the hospital, Zoe saw the news on her phone and broke down in tears. When Grayson arrived, he found her with her face buried in her hands. They'll never stop, Grayson. Maybe it's better if I disappear again. Grayson knelt in front of her, lifting her chin gently. Don't ever say that again. You're not alone, Zoe. These people know nothing about you or us. Determined to put an end to the lies, Grayson decided to take action. He arranged a press conference, knowing that leaving the narrative in the hands of others would only hurt Zoe further. In the crowded auditorium, journalists gathered, ready to ask questions. Grayson entered, his confident demeanor silencing the room. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady. I'm here to address some lies circulating about Zoe and our relationship. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Zoe is not manipulative, as some have suggested. She is a strong woman who has faced challenges that most of us can't even imagine. And above all, she is the woman I love. The room murmured, but Grayson pressed on, his voice unwavering. I chose to stand by her, not because I have to, but because I want to. And I will keep fighting for her and our child, no matter what anyone says. He opened the floor for questions, but only answered those that were respectful. By the end of the press conference, Grayson had taken control of the narrative, and slowly, the criticism began to fade. Zoe, watching the live broadcast in the hospital, cried again, but this time, it was tears of relief. When Grayson returned, she greeted him with a tight hug. "Would you really do all that for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I already am, Zoe," he said softly. As the dust from the public exposure began to settle, Zoe started to rebuild herself. She accepted an invitation to speak at a social event for homeless women, where she shared her story and talked about the importance of never giving up. Her words were powerful, moving everyone in the room. For the first time, Zoe didn't feel like someone just receiving help. She felt like someone who could inspire others. Grayson, watching from the back of the room, couldn't have been prouder. She was transforming, stepping out of the shadows of her past and into a brighter future. That night, as they drove back to the hospital, Zoe held Grayson's hand. "Maybe people don't change, Grayson. But today I realize that I can." He smiled at her, his eyes full of pride. "You've already changed, Zoe. And I couldn't be prouder of you." The days at the hospital began to feel routine. Grayson was always by Zoe's side, attending every appointment and staying updated on her and the baby's health. Despite everything they had endured, an unusual sense of calm surrounded them. It was as if they had finally found balance in the chaos. One quiet afternoon, as Grayson read a book by Zoe's bedside, she watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Do you think all of this was worth it?" she asked. Grayson closed the book and looked at her, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Anna, there's nothing in the world I would change. Everything we've been through has brought us here." Zoe smiled, but something still seemed to weigh on her mind. "What if I can't be everything you expect?" Grayson took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You already are everything I need." Before Zoe could respond, the doctor walked into the room, his expression serious but calm. Grayson immediately stood. "I have good news," the doctor said. "Zoe is stable, and so is the baby. However, we'll need to monitor her until the birth. Any complications could put both at risk." Grayson nodded, absorbing the information. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope for the future. Grayson was determined to face every challenge ahead with Zoe by his side. As the weeks passed, Zoe began to gain more confidence, encouraged by Grayson's unwavering support. He helped her make plans for the future, focusing on the joy and hope they were building together. In a particularly intimate moment, Grayson handed her a small surprise, a gesture that spoke volumes. "I know you don't like a lot of attention, but I thought this would be special," he said as he presented a small box. Inside, Zoe found a pair of baby shoes and a note that read, "Our future starts now." Tears filled Zoe's eyes as she held the shoes to her chest. "I don't know how to thank you for everything, Grayson." "You don't need to thank me, Zoe. You just need to believe," he replied softly. That night, as Grayson slept in the chair beside her bed, Zoe watched him silently. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly safe. In the days that followed, a new light began to shine in their lives. Grayson worked tirelessly to prepare their apartment to welcome the baby, while Zoe, still in the hospital, became more involved in the social projects they had started together. When Zoe was finally discharged, Grayson brought her home to an apartment that had been transformed into a warm and welcoming space. The crib was set up, the walls decorated in soft colors, and every detail seemed thoughtfully arranged. "Welcome home," Grayson said as he helped Zoe settle in. Zoe looked around, overwhelmed with emotion. For the first time, she felt like she had a place where she truly belonged. Time passed quickly, and the long-awaited day finally arrived. Grayson was by Zoe's side in the delivery room, holding her hand as she gave birth. The baby's cry filled the room, and tears of relief and joy streamed down both of their faces. When the baby was placed in Zoe's arms, she looked at Grayson, and in that moment, they both knew this was the beginning of a new chapter. "She's perfect," Zoe whispered as Grayson gently caressed their baby's tiny face. "So are you, Zoe," he said. In the following days, Grayson and Zoe navigated the challenges of parenthood together, learning with each passing moment. More than that, they became a family. One night, as Grayson held the baby in his arms and watched Zoe sleep peacefully on the couch. He reflected on everything they had been through. Every obstacle, every criticism, and every moment of doubt had led them to this place. After their daughter, Laura, was born, life took on a new rhythm for Grayson and Zoe. Their days now revolved around their little girl, whose smile seemed to brighten every space she entered. Grayson, who had once split his time between work and social obligations, now spent most of his days with Zoe and Laura. He was happier and more fulfilled than he had ever been. One afternoon, while Zoe was feeding Laura in the living room, Grayson walked in holding a small gift. Sitting beside her, he handed her the package with a smile. "What's this, Grayson?" Zoe asked, curious. "Something for Laura," he replied. Zoe opened the package and found a small gold bracelet engraved with their daughter's name. She looked at Grayson, moved. "It's beautiful. You always think of everything, don't you?" "I try," he said with a laugh. "But honestly, you two are all that matters to me now." Zoe smiled, but before she could respond, Laura let out a loud giggle, almost as if agreeing with her father. "Looks like she agrees with you," Zoe said, laughing. Months went by, and Grayson continued to show Zoe his unwavering dedication. He woke up in the middle of the night to care for Laura, made breakfast for Zoe, and insisted on setting aside evenings for them to watch movies or simply talk. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park, Grayson watched Zoe pushing Laura's stroller. The gentle breeze played with her hair, and he felt a warm swell in his chest. Without thinking, he took her hand and stopped her. "Zoe, you know how much I love you, don't you?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Zoe looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "I know, Grayson. And I love you too." Right there, in the middle of the park with people passing by, Grayson dropped to one knee. Zoe gasped, covering her mouth, as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "Zoe, from the moment you came into my life, everything changed. You showed me what truly matters, and I want to spend every day with you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Zoe's face as she nodded, unable to speak. Grayson slid the ring onto her finger, stood up, and embraced her tightly as onlookers clapped and cheered. "Yes, Grayson. I will." That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner at home while Laura slept peacefully in her crib nearby. Zoe couldn't stop glancing at the ring on her finger, feeling for the first time that the future seemed clear and full of promise. A few months later, Grayson received a phone call from his mother, Beatrice. Since Laura's birth, she had kept her distance, but now, she seemed ready to reach out. "Grayson, can I visit? I'd like to meet my granddaughter." Grayson hesitated for a moment but knew this was an important step for everyone. "Of course, Ma. We'll be waiting for you." When Beatrice arrived, Zoe felt nervous. Despite Grayson's unwavering support, she still feared she might not be fully accepted. But to her surprise, Beatrice seemed different from the cold woman Grayson had always described. "You must be Zoe," Beatrice said with a reserved smile. "Yes, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you," Zoe replied, trying to remain composed. Beatrice's gaze softened as she looked at Laura, cradled in Grayson's arms. "May I hold her?" Beatrice asked. Grayson handed Laura to his mother, who appeared genuinely moved as she held her granddaughter. "She's beautiful," Beatrice said, her voice trembling. Throughout the afternoon, the conversation went more smoothly than Zoe had expected. Beatrice asked about Laura's routine, and the tension began to ease. As the months passed, Grayson's mother, Beatrice, gradually opened up to Zoe. She offered a few motherly tips and even shared her thoughts on parenting, and Zoe began to realize that Beatrice's heart was slowly beginning to soften. When it was time for Beatrice to leave, she took Zoe's hand and said, "I know it took me a while to accept this, but I want you to know that you make my son happy, and that's what matters most to me." Zoe smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had always feared Beatrice's disapproval, but now, it felt like a new chapter had begun, one where she truly felt accepted. The following months were filled with wedding plans. Grayson wanted Zoe to have an unforgettable day, but he insisted it be intimate, focused on the people who truly mattered. When the big day arrived, Zoe wore a simple yet elegant white dress, and their daughter, Laura, was dressed as the sweetest flower girl, capturing everyone's attention. Grayson, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, could hardly take his eyes off Zoe as she walked down the aisle. The altar was decorated with white flowers, soft lights, and the sunset provided a breathtaking backdrop. During the ceremony, Grayson's vows were filled with emotion. "Zoe, you are the light that illuminated the darkness in my life. I promise to stand by your side through every step, every challenge, and every moment of joy." Zoe, holding back tears, replied, "Grayson, you've taught me what true love is. I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your family, today and always." When they kissed, applause filled the room, and Laura, sitting in Beatrice's lap, babbled something that made everyone laugh, as if she too was celebrating. The reception was intimate but full of joy. Zoe and Grayson shared their first dance as husband and wife, while Laura was doted on by her grandparents and close friends. That night, as they watched Laura peacefully sleep in her crib, Zoe held Grayson's hand and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me." Grayson kissed her forehead, smiling. "Giving up was never an option, Zoe." Though the future still held challenges, that night, both of them knew they were ready to face whatever came their way, together as a family.